Have you ever been told that the Gospels were written anonymously? Or maybe that Jesus didn't claim to be God? Well, you want to listen in to the in-depth conversation I'm going to have with the author, Dr. Brant Pitre, who will make the case for Jesus. I understand, Dr. Pitre, that you are a teacher and that you've written a book. Could you tell us where you teach and what book did you write?
Well, my name's Dr. Brant Pitre. I'm professor of sacred scripture at Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans, Louisiana, which is where I'm from. I teach there Old and New Testaments, and my background educationally is I have a PhD in theology with a focus in biblical studies from the University of Notre Dame, up a little further north, up in Indiana. And I also got a master's in biblical studies from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and then did my undergraduate at LSU, where I studied English literature and religious studies as well. So my educational background for years has really been focused on not just the study of the New Testament in particular, but looking at the New Testament in light of its ancient Jewish context. Yeah. And so that's one of the things that I tried to do in my new book, which is called The Case for Jesus.
You have it there?
Yeah, I got it right here. The Case for Jesus, the Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ. And basically the book comes out of my own experience of going through college and graduate school and learning things about the origin of the Gospels and about the divinity of Jesus that were difficult and challenging for me as a cradle Catholic. In particular, things like the origin of the Gospels. You know, who wrote the Gospels? Do we really know who wrote them? Are they historically reliable? Yeah. Were they originally anonymous? Other questions such as, did Jesus actually claim to be divine, or was that something that was later attributed to him? So in my own journey through that educational experience, I really went on a long road that both led me to kind of be shaken in my faith, but also eventually through my study precisely of the history, and in particular of Judaism at the time of Jesus, to come back to the Catholic faith in my youth, and understanding that there are actually good historical reasons for trusting the Gospels, and also that there are good historical reasons for concluding that Jesus did in fact claim to be divine, but that he did it in a Jewish way, and that when we see it through ancient Jewish eyes, we can understand the mystery of his divinity given to us in the Gospels.
So one thing that's very clear is that keeping your faith didn't require you to put aside your mind, but rather required you to use it more intensely and honestly than you had heretofore experienced, and you came through with all these degrees in this great book. So our first topic here is, were the Gospels written anonymously? I understand that the claim that they were written anonymously allows them to say that they're not written by eyewitnesses, which makes what they say less reliable and likely to all kinds of additions and thoughts of people whose thoughts aren't worth thinking about.
Yeah, so my own experience with what I call the anonymous Gospels theory really was as a young undergraduate. I remember in a classroom the professor coming in and saying, I want you all to forget everything you ever think you knew about who wrote the Gospels. All right? So they said, I know your Bibles say that the Gospels are according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John. But scholars today agree that originally the Gospels were anonymous. In other words, that they were originally published without any titles, and that they circulated in manuscript form without any titles for over or up to 100 years before the titles were added later by Christian scribes who were trying to give much needed authority to these texts in order to get people to believe them. So as a young student, I didn't know anything about the history. I only knew what I'd learned in catechism class. So I just took notes. Okay, Gospels originally anonymous, titles attached later. They circulated for a century without any titles. But the upshot of that theory, as I was later to realize, was to really kind of, in a sense, undermine the reliability of the Gospels. Because what it opens up is the possibility that these documents were not written by eyewitnesses or by contemporaries of the events, companions of eyewitnesses or apostles, but by later Christians whose identity is completely unknown to us, and whose relationship to the actual events of Jesus' life and death and resurrection was one of many, many times removed. In other words, one of the analogies I remember learning as a student was the so-called telephone game analogy.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
Yeah, you've heard this one, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I kind of cover it in the book, which is lots of scholars who think that the Gospels were originally anonymous will also say that the stories about Jesus in the Gospels are kind of like the children's game of telephone, which is where kids will sit around at a birthday party in a circle in a room, and one child tells the story to the next, who tells it to the next, they whisper it, right? Yeah. And then at the end of the line, you'll relay the story again and see how much it's changed in the line of transmission, and everyone gets a good laugh because the story gets completely altered. Well, in the textbook that I was using as a student, that was the analogy that the author had used to say that's what the stories of Jesus in the Gospels are like. They're like the end product of an ancient game of telephone, except that instead of just a few children on a Sunday afternoon, this is hundreds of Christians across decades in different countries, in different languages, so that by the time you get to the stories we actually have in the Gospels, we have no real way of knowing what's been changed, what's been altered, what's been added, what's subtracted, or whether they're reliable or not. And that really bowled me over. It was something that was troubling to me because I had always trusted the Gospels as reliable accounts of what Jesus did and said.
Take them at face value like most people do.
Yeah, I think most people when they open up the Gospels take them at face value. It's gospel truth, right? I mean, that's the whole reason we have that expression. And so this undermined the reliability of the Gospels, and so what it began to do in me was to raise the question, well, how do I know Jesus did this? How do I know Jesus said this? How do I know he really claimed to be divine? How do I know he was really crucified? And those questions kind of started to churn in me, and it really did pose a real challenge to my faith. And over time, I began to kind of, in a sense, lose that faith because I wasn't sure anymore about who Jesus was or even who he claimed to be.
So, question then for you. When you studied all this material, was the conclusion that the faith is real, was it based on concrete evidence or lots of subtleties and different people can have their own opinion, or was it really concrete?
Well, in this case, I was basically taking the majority opinion of scholars at their word, right? Because I was a student and I was being told this is what the majority of contemporary scholars believe, that the Gospels were originally anonymous and that the stories in the Gospels are more like folklore than like eyewitness testimony. They're more like a game of telephone than like a news report about an event that's recently happened. But what happened was, as I continued to do my own research and pursue my graduate degrees, especially when I went to the University of Notre Dame up in Indiana, there I had to learn Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and Coptic and all these ancient languages for myself, and I also began to study the manuscript tradition in the originals, right?
Now, what do you mean by manuscript tradition?
Well, the manuscript tradition are the most ancient copies of the Gospels that we possess. The Gospels are not originally written in English. They're originally written in ancient Greek. Koine Greek means common Greek. And so the manuscripts were handwritten copies of the Gospels that go back to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries AD. And we have hundreds and even thousands of these ancient copies. And so one of the things you have to do when you receive a PhD in biblical studies is study not just translations of the text, but the original languages. And so what I began to realize was that as I continued in my journey, I got curious about the original manuscripts because I had been learning for almost a decade that the original Gospels were anonymous. And so I remember asking one of my professors one day, well, I'd like to see the anonymous copies. Where are all the anonymous editions? And he said, well, go see if you can do some research. And what I discovered, which really rocked me, was that there are no anonymous manuscripts of any of the Gospels, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Every ancient Greek manuscript of the Gospel that we possess, if we've got the first pages of it, has a title. And not only that, all of the manuscript evidence is unanimous in attributing those 4 Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In other words, not only are the earliest Gospels telling us who wrote them, but they're all unanimous in attributing them to the same people. Now this really rocked me from the perspective of history because I had assumed, just based on what I was learning in the classroom, that the original manuscripts didn't have the titles. But the evidence was countering that.
So why did they think that?
Well, this theory basically came up in the late 19th century. It was a hypothesis that was made up, frankly, in the face of the manuscript evidence. A scholar named Adolf von Harnack, in particular, a German scholar, popularized the idea that because our manuscripts, our earliest manuscripts at that time weren't from the until the 3rd, 4th centuries, and that the titles said things like Good News according to Matthew, Good News according to Mark, that the earlier manuscripts must not have any titles. Well, we've learned since then, with the discovery of more ancient papyrus, which are fragmentary copies of the Gospels that go all the way back to the 2nd century, that that's just not true anymore.
Yeah.
All the earliest copies we possess, every copy we possess, has those titles. And even more, what happened to me was I also started to study the ancient church fathers. So the ancient church fathers are figures like Ignatius of Antioch, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus. These were men who lived in the early 2nd century AD, who were either disciples of the apostles or men who knew the apostles. So they were 1 or 2 generations removed. And as I began to read them for myself, what I discovered was that the church fathers were unanimous as well on who wrote these ancient books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now this really rocked me because I had expected ancient Christians to be as agnostic about who wrote the Gospels as my professors were, or as the scholars that I was reading. But then I realized that the earliest Christians, not only did they agree that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they just said so matter-of-factly. There was no controversy about this in the early centuries. It was just an accepted fact. Now this really blew me away because one of the things I'd learned as a scholar is that if you want to come to a historical conclusion about who wrote a book, you have 2 kinds of evidence you have to look at. There's internal evidence, in other words, the evidence from within the manuscript, the book itself, like a title. But then you also have external evidence. That's evidence from people who were around at the time the book was written, or people who knew people who had written the book, rough contemporaries. So for example, my book, right? I have internal evidence telling you I wrote it from the title. But also you could ask my wife or my children, hey, did Brant write a book? And they'd be able to tell you 50 years from now, he sure did, and he was up late nights writing it, right? So internal and external evidence, when those 2 things go together, they give us good reason to believe the books were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in this case, once again, the external evidence of the ancient Christians, known as the church fathers, was unanimous. Wow. And that really bowled me over. It really made me stop in my tracks and realize, well, hold on. If all of the evidence is unanimous that the Gospels weren't anonymous and that they're written by the apostles or by their companions, then that's a good reason to think that that is actually the case. Does that make sense?
Well, a person might say to you, okay, Dr. Pitre, if according to Matthew is a part of the ancient text, why isn't it in my Bible it says according to Matthew as the first verse? Why isn't that in there? Or if I'm a Greek student and I happen to have the Nestle Aland text 28th edition, and I look down at the bottom, I can see that there's not, for example, Papyri 66 listed, or Papyri, 75, I think you reference in the book.
Papyrus 4, too.
They're not in the apparatus at the bottom that tells us that other authorities say X. Why is that not the case?
That's a great question. At the risk of, I'll try to simplify it because it's kind of a complex discussion, but there's a great article written by a scholar who's a friend of mine, Simon Gathercole. He teaches at Cambridge in the UK. And he noticed that there were things that were missing from the footnotes, so to speak, of the standard Greek texts that scholars use when it came to the titles. In other words, the titles were being treated almost as if they weren't part of the manuscript tradition. So he went back and he actually looked at all the original copies themselves and put together the data to show that whenever we have those first pages of the ancient copies of the Gospels, the title is always there and they're unanimous on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So this guy's dealing with primary sources.
He's dealing with the primary
not secondary
text.
Or tertiary.
Not just your little Greek copy of the Bible you can buy at the bookstore that has the footnotes. These are the actual manuscripts themselves. He wrote a great article on this a few years ago. And when I read his article again, I thought, okay, well, hold on. We've got a problem here. And then I began to question this. Well, wait. If there's no manuscript evidence that the Gospels were anonymous, why do we continue to think that this theory makes sense? Another problem with the theory that the Gospels were anonymous is that it's just an incredible hypothesis. Think about it for a second, Noah. The standard theory says that the Gospels were originally written without any titles and that they circulated for over a century with no titles. And then around 180 AD, all the scribes throughout the Roman Empire, who had multiple copies by this point, all somehow miraculously added the exact same titles to the books so that they unanimously attributed them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, that's just not a credible scenario. If they had originally been anonymous, what we would expect is The scribe in Africa would attribute it maybe to Peter, whereas a scribe in Italy would attribute it to Mark. You see what I mean? There would be discrepancies in the manuscript tradition.
Is this theory on your part, or is there actual credible examples of this?
There's credible examples of this with a letter everyone who's read the New Testament knows, the letter to the Hebrews. So if we compare the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John with an actual anonymous book of the New Testament, which is the letter to the Hebrews, which has no name in the book or in the title, you're going to see a marked difference. Because Hebrews was written anonymously, it was published anonymously, and guess what happened? The church fathers debated about who wrote it.
Yeah.
Some church fathers said Paul wrote it. Some church fathers said Barnabas wrote it. Others said that Paul wrote it in Hebrew and Luke translated it into Greek. In other words, there were divisions, there were debate about who wrote it because it was originally anonymous. That's exactly what we don't find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's complete unanimity both in the manuscript evidence and in the ancient Christians known as the church fathers.
We sometimes hear about the Gospel of Thomas, there's other so-called Gospels out there. Did those come with titles or not titles? How did the early church or the successors of the apostles deal with that?
This is a great question. These days, many people are familiar with the so-called apocryphal Gospels or lost Gospels from historical documentaries on television that will tell us about recent findings like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas, and they often present these as if these are new things, we've never heard about them before. But the reality is, these are really old news for us as Catholics,
yes,
because the ancient church fathers themselves, people like St. Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of St. John, I mean this is the 2nd century, he talks about the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Thomas. He knew about them. And the difference between the 4 Gospels and the lost Gospels when it comes to evidence is this. It is true, in the so-called lost Gospels, they have titles attributing them to Judas or Peter or Thomas. That's internal evidence. But what they don't have is the external evidence.
Yes.
Because when you actually look at ancient Christian writers from the time of Jesus or shortly thereafter, they knew about these books. And when they saw these books published, they immediately identified them as the forgeries of heretics.
Yeah.
That's really important. In other words, the external evidence goes against the authenticity of the so-called lost Gospels, which, by the way, scholars today agree on that. Even atheists and skeptical scholars admit that the lost Gospels weren't published at the earliest till the mid to late 2nd century, over 100 years after lots of the apostles had died. So by definition, if they're published 100 years after the apostles have died, they can't be authentic, right? It's very hard to write books when you're dead. I don't know, it's hard enough to write books when you're alive. You can't write them when you're dead.
Yeah.
So if the Gospel of Judas doesn't come out until 180 AD and Judas killed himself around 33 AD, you know it's a forgery. But for our purposes here, what matters is the difference between the lost Gospels that were rejected by ancient Christians as forgeries and the 4 Gospels which were unanimously accepted as either eyewitness testimony, like Matthew and John, or by the disciples of apostles, like Mark and Luke, right? And not just by the church fathers. Even pagan critics like Celsus and Porphyry, who were opponents of Christianity, never challenged that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses.
Yes.
They just said you shouldn't believe them because they were foolish and ignorant fishermen.
Mm-hmm. So when you discovered all this and you tried to make it known to your colleagues, what happened?
Well, this book is really where I'm making it known to my colleagues. I began to have conversations with fellow New Testament scholars and fellow graduate students, and many of them were just surprised if they hadn't done the research for themselves, because we were all taught as young students that everyone knows now that the Gospels are anonymous. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean we looked at the evidence for ourselves, right? So a lot of times I get surprised, sometimes I get a little pushback, well wait, what about the lost Gospels? Or things like, well, how did John write a gospel if the book of Acts says that John was just a fisherman and that he was illiterate? That's an important question, right?
Yes, it is.
In the book of Acts chapter 4, it says that Peter and John were unlettered, literally in Greek, agrammatos, illiterate. So how could the Gospel of John have been written by an apostle if he was just a fisherman and he didn't even know how to write? Well, again, the church fathers make that really clear, because they say that in ancient times, as today, if you have trouble writing, you can get a secretary. That's exactly right. Yeah. And you can just dictate the book to a secretary. Politicians do this all the time. And in fact, if you read John out loud, you'll notice it kind of sounds like someone talking out loud. It's very beautifully crafted, but it goes back and forth. It rambles a bit. And so those kind of objections, like well, how did John write a gospel? Or what about Matthew? How would Matthew have been able to write? Well,
he was a tax collector.
He's a tax collector.
And he knows how to do this stuff.
He knows how to do this stuff because to be a tax collector, you would have had to be scribally literate. So you can imagine the disciples sitting around one day, listening to Jesus. And they're like, wow, this guy is really good. Maybe we should write some of this down. Let's see, who's here? Fisherman, 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 tax collector.
Yeah.
Hey, take out your pen and paper and take some notes, which we know that students did in the ancient world. And that's what we need to remember, especially the Gospels of Matthew and John. These aren't the end products of a game of telephone. These are the memories of Jesus' students.
Yes.
Memories of men, of students who lived with him, ate with him, traveled with him, and heard him preach over and over again. Not just, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings for 50 minutes like in college, but every day for 3 years. This is what scholars call skilled memory or trained memory. That's the kind of memories we're getting in the Gospels.
So you're claiming that associating the transmission of the message of Jesus in written form does not at all approximate the story told at the beginning, which is of the game of telephone.
That's exactly right. What I'm saying is the telephone game analogy is so anachronistic and so misleading that it has no place in a serious historical study of the life of Jesus. The best analogy is actually that of a biography based on the memories of eyewitnesses to an event. So you can think here of, even today, for example, taking down the testimony of people who experienced the Second World War or the Holocaust, right? Most of them have died, but there are still some survivors who you can interview today about their memories of those events. That's what the Gospels are like. In fact, the Church Fathers called them the memoirs of the apostles. Justin Martyr called them that because they were based on the skilled memories of Jesus' students.
The question would be, would it not, that these guys are not eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke, so how can they know what was going on?
I like to turn that argument on its head and say, well, first of all, Mark and Luke are the best argument against the anonymous gospels theory.
How so?
Because if you were going to falsely attribute a gospel to someone in order to give it authority, why would you pick Mark, who wasn't an eyewitness and who wasn't an apostle, or Luke, who wasn't an eyewitness or an apostle, who was just a companion of Paul? That doesn't make any sense. If you want to falsely attribute the gospel to someone to give it authority, why not just call it the Gospel of Peter? Or for that matter, go straight to the top and say, my gospel was written by Jesus himself. I mean, that's going to increase the sales, right? People would take it seriously. So the anonymous gospel theory completely breaks down in the face of Mark and Luke. Because the reason the Gospels were attributed to Mark and Luke, who were not eyewitnesses but the companions of apostles, is because Mark and Luke are actually the authors. That's the reason. And they're basing their evidence on the testimony of eyewitnesses, which, by the way, just a quick passage here, Luke tells us that.
Doesn't he?
He actually begins his Gospel in Luke chapter 1 with these words. Listen to what he says. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. It seemed good to me also to write an accurate account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you've been informed. That's Luke 1, verses 1 to 4. Now, does that sound like Luke's telling you a telephone game story? Does that sound like he's giving you a folk tale or a fairy tale?
Not at all.
No, if he had begun the gospel once upon a time, then you'd know, this is folklore, this is a fairy tale. But as scholars, New Testament scholars admit, the way Luke begins his gospel here is parallel to ancient Greek historians. In other words, Luke's saying, in effect, I'm not an eyewitness, right? I'm a second generation Christian.
And he admits that.
And he admits that. But my gospel is based on the testimony of those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. The Greek word there for eyewitness is autoptai. We get the word autopsy from it. In other words, those who have seen for themselves. And that shows you right there that Luke, just like the other gospels, is writing for us not a folk tale or much less a telephone game, but an ancient biography. He wants to tell us the truth about what Jesus did and what Jesus said.
Well, I guess I would ask the question, if I were a critic of your book and of your position there, you know, can so many scholars be so wrong? You must have some error in not looking at the right information, or presuming that information that it's concrete when whether it's really a left-hand choice or right-hand choice, take what you want.
Sure. Well, that's a good question, but what I would respond to it is by saying, I'm not alone. In fact, in the last 20 years or so, more and more New Testament scholars such as Richard Burridge, Michael Bird, Simon Gathercole, I mentioned elsewhere, these are Protestant, Catholic scholars alike, lots of different perspectives, are coming to agree that the old theory of the anonymous Gospels just doesn't hold water, and that when you look at the Gospels and compare them with other ancient writings from the time of Jesus, the best category for describing them is as biographies. Yeah. They are, there's an ancient Greek word, bios, we get the word life from that. The bios was a kind of writing that was basically an ancient form of the life of some major figure, a biography, for lack of a better word, of people like Josephus, or Plutarch wrote the lives of the Caesars, the biographies of the Caesars, and that's how we know about these ancient figures. So more and more scholars today are actually coming around to the position that I've argued in the book. So this book isn't just me flying solo. As you'll see, there are lots of footnotes showing that contemporary New Testament scholarship is changing its opinion about those matters in the face of the manuscript evidence, but also in the face of just studying the ancient Greek writings from the time of the Gospels themselves.
Now, if I can recap something and you tell me if I've got this right. Your questions begin with scholars whose work didn't seem to take into account the newest manuscript evidence or the tradition. So you decided you would go out and learn Greek and Hebrew and the other necessary languages to do it for yourself. Mm-hmm. And you had people that helped you find the original manuscripts, copies of them that are online, and you begin to read them. And as you read them, you found out that concretely they're written when you have the first page of the Gospel of Matthew or the others. It says Matthew, John, Luke, Mark. Yeah, sure. And that having read that, you realize that the conclusion was not subjective on your part to say they're reliable, but it was the weight of the evidence concretely laid before you.
That's exactly right. In other words, you don't have to be a believer. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to be a Catholic to come to the conclusion that in terms of the historical evidence, the most reasonable conclusion is not that the Gospels were anonymous or that they're the end product of a game of telephone. The most reasonable conclusion, just based on reason and on the evidence, is that the four Gospels were written by two apostles, Matthew and John, and by two companions of apostles, Luke and Mark. And that together they give us four ancient biographies, four testimonies to what Jesus of Nazareth, who lived in the 1st century AD, what he did, what he said, who he claimed to be, and also how, after being crucified by the Romans on the third day, he was raised from the dead. So that's the starting point for us as Christians. And you don't have to be a Christian to see that's where the historical evidence leads. At least that was my experience.
Well, next time, Dr. Pitre, we're going to address the prophecies of the Messiah and why that's important to understand the reliability of the Gospels.
Thank you.